Good evening. My name is Jenny Shirtliff, and on behalf of the Woodstock History Center, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Robert Goodby. Dr. Goodby graduated from Brown University, and this evening he's going to be talking to us about the long history of canoes, not only their connection to indigenous people, but also their connection to early European settlers. If you happen to have any questions during the program, please put them in the chat box. So welcome, Bob. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. I've been looking forward to this. Hello everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. So, yeah, my name is Bob Goodby. I'm an archaeologist, and as I was talking to Jenny before the program about how many years I've been doing this, but this is this is a new project for me, so I've been very excited about it and looking forward to talking about it. Canoes and the history of New England, particularly Native American canoes. And my interest in this really sort of started out when 26 years ago I joined the faculty of what was then Franklin Pierce College, now Franklin Pierce University, came into my classroom building and saw two really impressive dugout canoes on trestles in the hallway. And in a little while, was able to find out a bit of information about them. They came from a local pond in the next town over in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, and there was a little bit written about them. They'd never really been formally studied, but what I was able to find, there was a newspaper article published at the time the canoes were discovered, and what was said in that article really echoed the way that Native history has been portrayed in this part of New Hampshire, and in fact in a lot of northern New England. The standard history of the city of Keene, for instance, declares flat out that Indians never lived here. They may have wandered through on their way to one place or another, but there wasn't actually a presence here. And when these two dugout canoes came up off the bottom of Laurel Lake, rather than saying, wow, these certainly look like indigenous Native American canoes, they were ascribed to early Europeans. One of the interpretations was that they were used to carry grain from one side of the lake to the other. Another interpretation was that they were, in fact, feed troughs for animals, which then kind of begs the question of why somebody took them, dragged them 30 feet out into the lake, filled them with rocks, and sank them to the bottom. There was also the claim that they were European because you could allegedly see adze marks on them, even though we know as archaeologists that native people had used stone adzes for thousands of years, and by the 1600s were using adzes made of European iron. So there's really sort of this cloak of invisibility put on it. So here's the article from 1969 that makes all these claims. And the business about carrying grain across the lake, that just didn't ring true to me. But I went into the local history to see if there was anything in there that might explain an interpretation like that. I also looked at the old maps. So originally Laurel Lake is called South Pond. So here's South Pond in 1858. This is the body of water where these two canoes came from. And as far as carrying grain from one side to the other, that didn't make sense to me that you would spend so much time making one of these log boats when you had roads that went all the way around the pond. There'd be much easier ways to transport things. And the local history said nothing about the use of canoes like this. But as I was reading it, and there's a whole section of the history that's describing the different bodies of water in Fitzwilliam. So there's a description of South Pond, and then right below it, they're talking about another smaller pond that's over to the east called Sit Pond, and it just jumped out at me. Sit Pond was named after a man who the history said was an escaped or freed African American slave who was living on this pond with his wife, who is said to be an Indian. In fact, it turns out, I've learned just within the last month or so, that both of these people were part of the Nipmuc Native American community centered in central northern Massachusetts. And so, are there Native people here? Well, the town history says there were Native people here in the 1700s. So we're going to come back to these canoes at the end of the talk, but that's sort of a good place to start. That's where my this particular project began for me. Um, there was another thing that I was interested in that tied in with the whole business of canoes. The more that I've been doing this work, one of the things I've been really impressed with is that the Native American people here in New Hampshire, Vermont, northern New England generally, well, you might think of them as being Stone Age people. They were making stone tools until the Europeans arrived. They were living in very small communities. They did not have agriculture until fairly late in history, and it's easy to think of them as probably being sort of isolated, limited. And yet the evidence says exactly the opposite. Going back almost 13,000 years, it says that the native people here had connections that span hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles across North America. One of the first ways we see this is with the earliest culture, the so-called Paleo-Indians, who came in at the end of the Ice Age, and they were making and using a very sophisticated stone technology, producing these beautifully crafted fluted points, which were spear tips. And this is a technology and a style that is shared by people all across the North American continent, from one coast to the other, from the Great Lakes all the way down to Mexico. Ideas and technology and adaptive strategies are being shared. And then a few thousand years go by, and an archaeologist, Dina Dinkos, is excavating a site in Manchester, New Hampshire, actually studying the materials that came from that site. And she uses radiocarbon dating to age a couple of distinct projectile point styles, spanning between 7 and 8 thousand years ago. And once she's done that, she begins to recognize that this style of point, rather than being limited to New Hampshire, is actually found all down the Atlantic seaboard, from Maine all the way to Georgia. And she coins this term the Atlantic Slope macro tradition to talk about this huge area in which people are interacting and sharing ideas. And you see other things in other points of history. One of the most exciting artifacts I was ever involved in finding is this beautifully made stone tool. You're seeing the front and the back of it here. I found it doing a project in Lebanon, New Hampshire, right on the Connecticut River. And the first thing that jumped out at me was the quality of the stone. I had never seen anything like it in decades of working in New England. And the shape of it was unusual. Well, it turns out that the shape is just like the shape of stone tools that are mass produced or were mass produced as part of what archaeologists call the Hopewell culture, one of the early mound building cultures from the Midwest out in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, dating between 1600 and 2000 years BP, before present. You'll see that abbreviation a bunch of times, especially once we get into the radiocarbon dating. And so it looks like one of these mound builder points. It's made out of a material that no one has ever seen in New England before. I had some colleagues say, well, it might come from Quebec. They have some really nice stone up there. And I showed it to archaeologists in Quebec. They said, wow, that's nice stuff. It's not from around here. They suggested it might have come from Ohio. There's a formation called the Flint Ridge Formation out there. Showed it to folks in Ohio. They said, wow, that's beautiful stuff. It doesn't come from here. Try the people in Quebec. So it's a mystery, but it gives us that sense of connections, that people were getting things and interacting with other people far away. And canoes, I thought, may well have been a central feature of that. This is how you travel significant distances. So we know from the history and the archaeology and native traditions that the native people in northern New England made two different kinds of canoes. They made birch bark canoes, which are really good. They're very much easier to portage. So if you have to haul the canoe out, get around the falls, that's a good way to do it. They're good for fast moving, shallow, rocky rivers. And the other kind of canoes they used were dugout canoes. Now, the problem with the birch bark canoes, from as an archaeologist, is that they do not survive. We have almost no examples of these from, say, before the 18th century. This one you're seeing in this picture is one of the only ones we have. It's simply not, they're not heavy enough and durable enough to have stood the test of time. So almost all what I'm going to be talking about tonight are the dugout canoes. And before I get to those, in terms of moving around and the connections, in New Hampshire, we have this map that's been around since the 1960s. We're very fond of it. It's a map of Indian trails, and you can see these trails going all across the state, extending into Vermont, into Maine, down into Massachusetts. And this network of trails, many of these also parallel rivers. So the rivers are natural transportation corridors. They're the low points through the landscape, whether you're walking or canoeing. This is the sort of geography that people had when they were interacting with their neighbors. Now, the dugout canoes that we find here and that I'm going to be focusing on tonight are similar to those made and used by native people over a wide stretch of eastern North America. And we're getting more and more data on these canoes. We almost always find them at the bottoms of lakes and ponds because what would happen is they would be intentionally sunk. So when winter is coming on, the cold would freeze and crack a wooden canoe. And so people would take it out into the water, fill it with rocks, sink it down into the mud where it would stay unfrozen. And that's a relatively anaerobic environment. You're not going to get a lot of rapid decay down there. And then in the spring, take it back up again unless something happened and you didn't get back to it, in which case it would be left there. And that's almost always what we're finding. And there's even this remarkable example that got a lot of attention a few years ago. On a good-sized lake in Wisconsin, they found a whole bunch of canoes, 16 of them, ranging in age from a little over 5,000 years to about 700 years old. They described it as a canoe parking lot. Uh, They were made of all different kinds of wood, and this is a pattern we're going to see. And there's a photograph of one, so you can see the rocks in it and how it was intentionally sunk. Now, even though this is all the way out in Wisconsin, we're going to be seeing very, very similar things in New Hampshire and Vermont as well. Uh, so, making a dugout canoe, we have a really good handle on how this happens, and it comes from two sources. One is the Europeans who wrote extensively about this. They saw native people making these canoes and described it in many, many different accounts. The other source of information we have is from native people themselves, many of whom have been resurrecting this technology in the last few decades. So this is a living, ongoing indigenous technology here in New England. So you can see going all the way back to 1590, Theodore DeBry in North Carolina is describing this basic process. You take a big log, you start a fire, okay, use the fire to do most of the work. Okay, although you're as the fire is turning the wood into charcoal, you're scraping away, burning, scraping away. Here's a picture of a machoon that the Hasamanisco Nipmuc band was making. So same sort of technology. We have very good historic accounts, okay, not only from North Carolina, but a number of them from New England from the 17th century. So we have William Wood, who's one of the early chroniclers of Plymouth Plantation, and he's describing the same thing. They burn them hollow, scraping them smooth with clamshells and cutting the outsides with stone hatchets. Roger Williams, who was living with the Narragansett and spoke their language, was a very astute observer of Narragansett culture, is telling us they're made of a whole variety of woods. Same thing that we were seeing out in Wisconsin. And the combination of burning and scraping and chopping. And he describes 10 or 12 days of pretty intensive labor being necessary to make these canoes. So when we think about them being sunk in the bottom of the lakes and ponds, people wanted to make these last. This was quite an investment. And he's talking about them taking them out into the ocean to fish. And another really good detail that Williams gives us about these boats, he says they really varied in size. So sometimes they'd make them that would hold 3 or 4 people. But then look at the last part of that line. Some will carry 20, 30, 40 men. Imagine a log boat, a dugout canoe that's going to carry 40 people. That is a substantial, massive vessel. So this is a really important part of native movement, transportation, interaction, and survival because these are used for a variety of things in everyday life, fishing, trapping, hunting, etc. From my own area of southwestern New Hampshire in the Monadnock region, we have a really interesting account. Some of our first written descriptions of this region come from Samuel Willard in 1725, and he's going across the landscape, and this is even after terrible epidemics have decimated the native population. Yet in 1725, he's seeing evidence of native people everywhere he goes, including one case where on Lake Monadnock that straddles the New Hampshire, Massachusetts border. He says, we found where the Indians had lived last year and made a canoe. So there's plenty of evidence that this technology is continuing after European contact into the 18th century, and it's going to continue even further than that. So, one of the questions we have, and one of the problems with the data that we have here, the vast majority of the canoes that we know about are from the historic period. And often that means they could have been made by native people. They could have been made by Europeans because there were some Europeans, particularly the Irish and the English, who came over here with their own traditions of making log boats. So after a while, the identity of the makers becomes a little fuzzy. But what about before European contact? How do we know there were canoes? Well, we do have some evidence for this. One is this is a petroglyph or rock carving site from Maine, and you have boats, okay, very clearly illustrated with people paddling them. And other things we can infer from what people are eating. So in this wonderful book by my colleague Bruce Bork up in Maine, he is describing a culture around from 3 to 5 thousand years ago that sort of spread from the coast of New Hampshire up through central Maine. And one of the things these people they were very focused on marine resources, but they would hunt swordfish with harpoons. Swordfish are a deep water pelagic species, and the estimates are they would have to go out at least 25 miles from shore to find these fish. These big, dangerous fish that they harpooned, got onto their boat, and brought them back. You need a substantial vessel to do that sort of thing. So we're able to infer the presence of boats even when we're not able to actually find them. Archaeologists have also, and this gets us into some thin ice. Um, they have also inferred the existence of canoes from all the heavy-duty stone woodworking tools that we find, adzes and gouges and axes and things of this sort. And certainly some of these may have been used to make canoes, but they can also be used to make other things. And we don't have any surefire way to tell what exactly the use was. So these are out there suggesting but not proving the existence of canoes, and these heavy woodworking tools can be as old as 8 or 9 thousand years in New England. Uh, Now, what do we actually know from canoes that have survived? Like I said, the vast majority are from the time after European contact. We have a handful of examples that predate it. The oldest one is came out of a tidal mudflat in Kennebunk, Maine, in southern Maine, discovered a few years ago. A really interesting boat made of yellow birch, which is a little unusual. They're typically made of pine, but can be other things. They got a radiocarbon date between 1275 and 1380 AD. And this is the oldest radiocarbon dated canoe that we have. You can see from the illustration here that only part of it survived. So we have one end, the other end is gone, so it's very fragmentary. We can't estimate its complete length, but very certainly a canoe. And in terms of dated vessels, this is our starting point. Here's another example. There are actually a couple of these from Shelburne Pond in Vermont that have been carbon dated. This one, the range is 1450 to 1570 AD. In northern Vermont, this is pretty clearly before European contact, certainly before any substantial European contact. And you can see the remains of the canoe. These two holes in it are actually modern. That is where samples of wood were taken out, one for radiocarbon dating and the other to do analysis of the wood itself. This is the second oldest one that we have. The only other clearly pre-contact one, I think, is this one from Ossipee Lake, which is up in sort of north central New Hampshire, right on the main border at the headwaters of the Saco River. And this is an interesting place. There's actually some evidence for very early European contact in this area that might go as far back as 1660. But in all likelihood, this is a Native American canoe. Um, so that's what we have in terms of the three examples that clearly date before contact. Now, before I get into the data that I've gotten recently, I just want to give a quick shout out and acknowledgement. There are three sources here. I did not start this project without a foundation. And the foundation I used came from the work of three people. Marianne Plain did a master's thesis and then published an article on what she called New England's log boats, looking at Native American boats, but also the boats that were being made by Europeans. And this gave me a real start and a real sense of the complexity rather than just assuming that these are Native American boats. You've got to be a little more nuanced than that. There was actually an undergraduate research paper by Jane Jordan from the University of Vermont that is a very thorough catalog of all the dugout canoes that had come from Vermont. That was very useful. And the third was a piece of work by Colleen Dugan, published in the New Hampshire Archaeologist, which is an inventory of dugout canoes in New Hampshire. And so I could start off with this list, and here's Colleen Dugan's list. And so I knew about these canoes. Some of them had been radiocarbon dated. There's the Ossipee Lake one. But the others, you're looking at some pretty recent dates, 1834, 1890, and some that were, probably historic. I was able to look at some of the canoes on this list that hadn't been dated, and I was also able to add a few to it. So this is the foundation I started off with. Now, so my project that I got funding for in the over the last couple of years, radiocarbon dating dugout canoes. I had a couple of goals. Number one, I wanted to just date more canoes. That in and of itself, I thought would be a positive thing, give us a sense of how old they might be. I was particularly, and I will confess, I was particularly keen to find ones that clearly predated European contact. The older the better, so we could see exactly how far back this technology went. I also wanted to use this because one of the things that Marianne Plain and some other folks had noted is there seems to be a change in form in the canoes. Before European contact, they have tapered, sloping ends. After European contact, the stern in particular seems to be squared off. And so that would be an interesting way to see what the effects of European presence had on this technology. And so I got funding to date seven canoes in total, one from a few years ago in 2022, and then six of them last year. So that is what I'm starting with. So I actually had one other experience working with canoes, and this one went way back. In the 1990s, I returned to my alma mater, the University of New Hampshire, and taught there for a few years. And while I was there, I was contacted by the Historical Society of Sandwich, New Hampshire, which is on the Squam Lake, one of our most beautiful bodies of water. And they had for some years a massive dugout canoe in their collection that had come off the bottom of Squam Lake, and they wanted to know if it was Native American. And I visited. I couldn't see anything in the canoe itself that gave me a hint one way or the other. But I said the best way to do this is to take a small sample of the wood, send it in for radiocarbon dating. And so they did, and the results came back. Okay, and this is what they said. Here's the report from the radiocarbon lab. It was startling and a little disappointing because the radiocarbon report said that this wood was essentially modern, 20th century. In fact, they could even somehow see in the results the effects of the 1940s atomic bomb testing. And that really, what was going on here? I mean, who is making a massive boat like this in the 20th century? That was a real conundrum, and that's going to sort of set a pattern here. Now, before I go on, a couple things about radiocarbon dating. Um, it is going to date because it's measuring the decay of the isotope carbon 14 into carbon 12. That decay begins once an organism has died. So in this case, what radiocarbon dating is really dating is not when the canoe was made, but when the tree it's made of died. Now, my colleagues in the Nipmuc community who are making these canoes tell me there's not going to be a lot of time between those because you want to make a canoe out of green wood. It's much easier to control the burning that way. So not so much of an issue. The second thing about carbon dating is it's not pinpoint precise. It usually gives you a range. A standard radiocarbon date will have a plus or minus figure, which is a 1 sigma or 67% chance. So it'll give you one date and then a range on either side of it. But one of the things I learned in this project, and something that the carbon dating labs have just recently discovered, because of all the carbon put into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, very recent dates are not coming back with a single point and a spread around it. They're coming back with two or three what are called intercept points on the calibration curve. So rather than having a nice simple single date, you may get three different ranges that you need to look at, and you're going to see that. So this is the first date I had, but this is not part of the seven canoes I'll be talking about tonight. This is the first one in my current study, found from the town of Derry, New Hampshire, which is in the southern part of the state. Displayed very nicely in a local historical society. The wood is identified as sweet gum, and I'm skeptical about that. Simply because what I learned was that the range of sweet gum doesn't really extend much into the very southern part of New England. And so, leaving that aside, the other thing that was interesting about this was another canoe was found very close to it. And that's a pattern we're going to see in a number of cases. That canoe did not survive, but this one is up there. Now, the thing about this little lake that it came off of, Beaver Lake, is to use the Northern New England expression, you can't get there from here. Uh, Beaver Lake, the outlet streams are so narrow, you could not take a canoe out of Beaver Lake and get anywhere else, and you couldn't paddle into Beaver Lake from anywhere else. In other words, the canoe was made specifically for use on this body of water. And that's something we're going to see in a number of these. So that was the first one I looked at. Okay, very interesting. And here's the carbon date. And so here you can see those different ranges I was talking about. So a 68% chance that it's between 1800 and 1939 when we really didn't think anyone was making dugout canoes in this area. 25% chance it might be between 1682 and 1738, which is much earlier, but in this part of New Hampshire, that is definitely after European contact. So very clearly, either one of these in the historic period. Here's my second one. This is from a little pond in Andover, New Hampshire, in sort of the western part of the state. Discovered, as almost all of them are, filled with rocks and intentionally sunk down to the bottom. And when this came up about 45 years ago, local historians said this isn't an Indian canoe. This is something made by the early settlers. There were some recollections that these kinds of boats were made, and which is certainly a possibility. So you got a couple of pictures here from the time of discovery, and one of the funny rules is apparently when you find one of these things on the bottom of a pond and you bring it up, the first thing people want to do is take it for a ride. And so we see somebody here in the canoe in 1980 trying it out. Um, so that is that canoe. And just like the other bodies of water we've seen, Adder Pond or Hopkins Pond, where this canoe came from, is a small upland pond, and you can't get in or out via canoe. So this canoe was made only to be used on this body of water. We got a carbon date, okay? And this is also, okay, the standard range 1800 to 1860. You can see the two calibration ranges there, possibly as old as 1678, but the odds are very good this is a historic period canoe. Again, begging the question, who's making these? Because the assumption had been that this technology leaves with the Indians, who tend to get pushed off the stage of history as early as possible. Here's the next one. This one is from Vermont, way up the Connecticut River drainage in Newbury. And this is a really interesting canoe. So you're seeing it from two different angles here. It is long and relatively narrow. And this canoe has a story that goes along with it that made it even more interesting. And the story has to do with a character who, in the local history, is referred to as Joe Indian or Indian Joe, uh, who was supposedly, and this is a classic trope in these kinds of early historical accounts, whenever they talk about an Indian, it's almost always the last one, so that they can draw a line and say no more Indians after this. But he was called the last of the Cowasuk Indians. And in the history, it says the remains of a log canoe made by Joe were seen on Round Pond. Well, is this Joe's canoe? He was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He was a scout for the Continental Army, and we have his death date, February 1819. Well, it turns out Joe was actually a prolific maker of canoes because in Jane Jordan's inventory of Vermont canoes, here's Joe again, only now he's showing up in Stowe. And there's a canoe on a pond in Stowe that's also being attributed to him. Same guy, because there's his death date right there. Uh, so, what does the radiocarbon dating tell us? Is this story plausible? Because you want to take these with a little bit of skepticism. There are a lot of apocryphal stories about, the last native people in this area. So there's Round Pond, and again, you can't get there from anywhere else. So this 21-foot canoe, purpose built for use on this pond. The date comes in, and it actually fits very well with the story of Joe Indian. Doesn't prove that's who made it, but it's consistent with it. A standard date, late 18th century. There are your two ranges. Okay, this range right here, the most probable one, that is right in the middle of Joe Indian. Um, so here we have it, another historic canoe, but one that clearly could be native, okay, or might be European. So here's the next one. This is from Londonderry, New Hampshire, right next to Derry, and it's from a little pond called Scoby Pond. There was not a lot left of this canoe when it was found in the 1930s, but you can see one end of it very clearly. You can see the burning from its manufacture. It's very nicely displayed with a mirror above it, so you can see that. There's Scoby Pond, same thing. Can't get there from anywhere else. And here's our carbon date. Now, this one is interesting. The standard range, 1730 to 1790. And at this time in New Hampshire, this is the French and Indian War period. Okay, much of and there were a lot of native people, a lot of Abenaki people in the area who'd been here for thousands of years, but they were the front line in this war. But there's also European settlement. And so this is ambiguous. We don't really know who is making this canoe. So I've got uh, two more. This one is from Kingston, New Hampshire, toward the New Hampshire seacoast, and it's found on a little tributary of the Merrimack River. This one did not come from the bottom of a pond or a lake. This is one of the exceptions. Um, it was found in the muddy bank of this little tributary river, the Powwow River. There again, you haul it out. You got to get in it and take a picture. And so here's the Powwow River right here. So this is not only unusual in that it's in a river instead of a pond, but the Powwow River is navigable. You can get there from other places. So this one is a little bit different. And we got the date on this, and this was we didn't get an older date than this one. It's not ancient. Okay, so the standard date there you can see 1670 to 1730 AD. And you can see the two ranges here. Actually, the most probable range is 1628 to 1680. Uh, Now, at this time, though, in southeastern New Hampshire, this is the time of European settlement. We have European settlements in the coastal region of New Hampshire that go back to the late 1620s and 1630s. So once again, we've got a canoe that is probably native, but could be European as well. And then the final canoe is this one here. And this came from a little upland lake in the small town of Unity, New Hampshire, called Crescent Lake. It is a really substantial canoe. This is a quite a big, sturdy vessel, almost 19 feet long, one of the biggest ones that I had seen. And once again, we're talking about a landlocked body of water. So this big canoe is made for this lake. We got the date, and the date is actually exactly the same as the one from Kingston on the other side of the state, a 1670 to 1730. But the big difference is in this part of the state, in the western part of New Hampshire, this predates European settlement. And so if you're looking at this range here, the most probable range is actually 1628 to 1680. That clearly predates any kind of European settlement here and really sort of predates much in the way of significant European presence, never mind settlement. So this is a very good candidate for a Native American canoe. You also have to ask who in this early period would be spending a week or two of intense labor building a purpose-built canoe for a little upland body of water like this. The European doesn't make sense to me. I'm fairly certain this is a native canoe. And then the final one. Let's go back to where we started with the two canoes found from Fitzwilliam from Laurel Lake. They're really quite a pair. They were found fairly close to each other. They are essentially identical in size. They're identical in form, very little difference between them. Um, and these are the ones that had been discounted as being native. Well, we were able to get a radiocarbon date on them. Right? And there again is Laurel Lake where they came from, another landlocked body of water. So two good sized purpose-built canoes. And when the date came back, this is the oldest of any of the dates I've gotten on these dugout canoes. So a standard range between 1660 and 1720. The earliest settlement in this part of New Hampshire dates to around 1738 or so. So this is almost certainly, and again, because it's on a remote upland little body of water, this is almost certainly a Native American canoe. And if you look at the ranges here, the most probable one is 1620 to 1674. And that definitely predates any European settlement. There are a handful of European traders in the area at this time, But the idea that one of them would build two massive canoes on this little upland pond really doesn't add up. The second most probable range is even earlier, 1516 to 1590. So this, the one that was discounted, this is our best case for a Native American canoe. So, um, one of the big questions that came out of this is, given the dates we're getting, given the pattern we're seeing, who is continuing to make dugout canoes in the 19th and even into the 20th century? A technology that supposedly disappeared when the native people, the Abenaki, supposedly disappeared at the end of the French and Indian Wars. And to get a sense of this, you go into the history. And I've just started this process, but come across some interesting things. There's another canoe, not in my sample of them, from another one from up on Squam Lake that was radiocarbon dated a few years ago, has a long range, 1660 to 1950. But there is also a newspaper story talking about a dugout canoe from Squam Lake. Okay, quite possibly this canoe, and it's saying it was made by somebody named Bartlett Smith. He was a known person. His family was known. He decided to build this canoe to get back and forth across the lake. It's got a really weird shape, doesn't look terribly seaworthy. And he and a friend took it across the lake. It sank halfway across, and his friend drowned. So we have a historic story of somebody in the 19th century attempting to make one of these canoes. That seems a little weird. I mean, it happened apparently, but a little bit of an aberration. Much more revealing. Some of my colleagues in Vermont put me on to historic evidence that dugout canoes continued to be made in the 19th and 20th century in the rural, remote areas where people are pretty poor and looking for ways to supplement their income, particularly anything that will generate a cash income. And we have accounts of people in these places making dugout canoes to trap muskrats. Muskrats were valuable not only for their fur, but their main value coming from their name was their musk, which was really valued in the perfume industry. And so we have a historic account of this family making a dugout canoe and using it in the 19th and into the 20th century. It's there in living memory. Go back to Jane Jordan's inventory, and we have two more examples, okay, where dugouts are remembered in the memory of these communities who made them, and again, the fact that they were used for muskrat hunting. So these things continue, used in a new way, and there's a question of who is using them. Uh, Um, that was something I did not appreciate being a significant finding of this study. Uh, Now, wrap it all up. I've got 10 takeaways. Okay. Number one, there are a surprising number of these boats out there. They're an important part of the archaeology of northern New England. Number two, this pattern where they're purpose built for these little ponds is one that is only just coming into focus. I started off thinking of canoes as being used for long distance travel to explain that big world of the native people, but the ones I'm finding are not. Now, however, the thing I had to keep in mind was that if there were other, maybe even bigger canoes used on the major rivers or on the ocean, we're not finding those. Those would have been left in environments that are not really conducive to preservation. And so our sample is really skewed toward these ones from the smaller upland ponds. Number four, this pattern that we see all across eastern North America, shared by native people. You make these canoes, takes a lot of work, and you make them last by sinking them before every winter and bringing them up again in the spring. There's a lot of variation in size, not as extreme as what Roger Williams reported, but quite a bit of variation, and there's no correlation between how big the body of water is and how big the canoe is. Don't know quite what to make of that, but there it is. A lot of different woods were used for these. Pine seems to be the most common, but there were a lot of other options out there. Number seven, this business about finding multiple canoes. We've seen that over and over and over again. And I think probably part of the reason is that these bodies of water were lived on for long periods of time, but also canoes would be made perhaps by a number of different families living together. And they would be used in conjunction with each other to trap and hunt and fish and things of this sort. There is some change in the shape of them after contact, particularly the stern getting squared off. That seems to be a telltale sign of a post-European contact canoe. And the survival of these in the rural, poor areas of northern New England is a really interesting pattern and one that needs a little bit more study. We tend to draw these lines, whether you're a historian or an archaeologist, we like to draw a nice, strong line between the native people and the Europeans. But they weren't separate. They were in the same places. They interacted. In some cases, particularly in far northern New England, they even intermarried. They borrowed technology and ideas from each other. So by the time we get into the 18th and 19th century, rather than thinking, is this an Indian canoe or is it a European canoe? That's probably the wrong question to ask. And I think what we're seeing is a tradition that is a New England tradition that draws from both places, and we need to think of it in that sense. So part of it is a survival of this indigenous technology up to the present. Now, I had a great time doing this project, and I want to continue it. And I got a few things I'm gonna do in the future. So I got one last slide before we really wrap this up. And I'm gonna start. This is my only slide with animation because as I was finishing up this stage of the project, I got contacted by a gentleman in New Hampshire who said, "I've got another one," and he's a diver. And this is one from New Hampshire, and I'm gonna show you. Okay. This is his footage. You can see the rocks weighing the canoe down. Okay. So I am hoping to continue this process of finding and dating canoes, working on ways to protect and preserve them. Right now, in both New Hampshire and Vermont, the protocol that the state archaeologists want, if you find one of these, they want you to leave it in the water. They preserve very well there, whereas bringing them up onto shore risks them falling apart, risks very rapid decay. But even in the water, once they're discovered, they're at some risk. So it's a problem we need to think about. I want to do more research of finding out who is making these canoes in the 19th and 20th century. What kind of people are they? What is their background? Um, and with the native canoes, if you're finding a number of canoes in a pond, like on Laurel Lake, there had to have been a site nearby. And I'd like to look for the sites that are related to them and can shed some more light on what they were being used for. And then finally, working more with the native community. Because native groups like the Nipmuc and the Mashpee Wampanoag and some of the other nations in New England are still making these canoes. They know a lot about this technology and can shed a lot of light on what we're finding in the archaeology. And I think some of the things the archaeologists are finding will certainly be of interest to them. So that's the direction I'm heading in. A bunch of people to thank. This was a real collaborative effort. I got assistance from museums and the native community and other archaeologists as well that made all of this possible. And then finally, I was thinking about the old public radio show Car Talk as I was doing this because they had one segment, I think they called it the shameless self-promotion segment. So here comes my shameless self-promotion segment. If you're interested in this native history in northern New England, I wrote a book a few years back on my work in this region. It is not a technical scientific monograph. It's written to be accessible to a broad audience. A lot of it's written in the first person. So you can get it through your local bookstore. They will order it for you. There's a QR code and the usual big online retailers, things like that in case you're interested. So that is my tale, and I'm going to turn it back to Jenny to see if we had any questions come in and see what I can do with them. So, and I want to thank you again, folks, for coming out tonight.
Well, we're waiting for people to type in their questions. I have one for you, Robert. You
Okay.
mentioned that the canoes tend to start deteriorating as soon as they're exposed to air. For those that have already been brought up and exposed to air, are there any particular steps that are recommended to augment the preservation of those canoes?
There is a whole technical literature on the preservation of these. There are some, and usually the first step, ideally, is to keep them in water. So even if you bring them up, put them in some kind of large container with circulating water, and then you can work out a long-term preservation plan. There are various chemical compounds that can help stabilize them. One of the things, though, that we run into is those can interfere with radiocarbon dating. And I actually had one canoe, the one from Kingston, that when it was found in the 1930s was sort of in tender condition, so they saturated it with linseed oil. Fortunately, the carbon labs worked out a way to extract that particular contaminant. So for a few hundred additional dollars, they were able to do that. But in the event of bringing one up, I think the first step is to keep it wet and then get some expert advice. In fact, have the experts there before it comes out of the water.
Now, you also mentioned that most of these have been sunk in lakes or in rivers. How deep down were they sunk? Because, one can imagine if it was very deep, people would have difficulty in retrieving them.
Exactly, and the two from Laurel Lake are a good example of this because they're 30 feet out in the water. Uh, Now, I think for the most part, these canoes, because of what you said, these canoes would be sunk fairly close to shore. But one thing to remember is that a lot of our lakes and ponds have artificial shorelines because they were dammed in the 19th or 20th centuries. So their shorelines expanded. So something that's now 30 feet out into the water might have been 10 feet before the dam was built. Um, so my hunch is they were sunk not far from shore, typically. No.
Any other questions from our audience? Well, I don't see any other questions, but I'm sure if people think of questions later on, if you send them to me, I'll be happy to forward them and see if Robert can provide us with an answer. In the meantime, I want to thank all of you who have joined us this evening in the audience, as well as Bob. Thank you very much, and I hope you all have a nice evening. Good
Hey,
night,
hey, thank you
everyone.
very much. And thank you, Jenny. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.